Hi there, Editing Ravi coming to you from the future. Just wanted to issue a couple of notes in relation to this episode of Two Lost Souls that you are about to hear. In relation to the KSA, while we originally stated that we were going to do an entire episode dedicated to it, we felt that it only really merited half an episode in terms of coverage, and we're hoping that actually this shows that the KSA isn't the big terrifying beast that it can sometimes be built up to be, given that we can squeeze pretty much all the content that we have on it into half an episode. Speaking of the KSA segment of today's show, you may notice that the audio quality changes when we get to that part of the show. We did record it in person, however, due to some technical issues, we ended up having to re-record the entire segment remotely, which is why we start to sound slightly different. But we wanted to be upfront and honest with you about that. We hope you enjoy the episode that's about to come up, or at least find it very informative. If you have any questions or concerns about anything that comes up in today's show, drop us a line via the usual channels, and we hope you enjoy listening. Hi, I'm Ravi.
And I'm Shell.
And you're listening to Two Lost Souls,
the podcast that guides you through the journey to becoming a CBT therapist.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you are listening. Welcome to the Two Lost Souls podcast. The title of today's episode is How Do I Get In? I am your host, Ravi Amrith, and in today's show we will be discussing our top tips for navigating the selection process and doing the dreaded KSA. But let me begin by saying that this is your podcast guide to surviving a high-intensity CBT course. We pride ourselves on creating a safe space for trainees, qualified therapists, and those who are just generally curious. Honesty is our policy, and we tell it how we see it, but we would love to hear your views too. As usual, I am joined in the therapy room today by our fabulous co-host, Michelle Sudbury. How's it going, Michelle?
Really good, Ravi. How are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. How are things going?
Very well, yeah. Having a good week again this week, so
good.
That's nice.
Productive?
Very. Getting a lot done.
Oh, amazing. That's really good to hear. Just before we move on with the rest of the episode, let me remind all of you out there that if you have any particular questions or topics that you would like to see covered, reach out to us on Twitter at TLS_pod or by email at twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com. Today's episode looking at the application process, the selection process, and the KSA. Let's go in sort of chronological order, shall we? So, what are your reflections on the application process that you went through, Shell?
So I think, like I mentioned last week, I didn't really go through a traditional application route.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you would be better to kind of give your experience, because I think you went much more traditional, didn't you?
Yeah. My memories of it were being quite intense, and quite, some of it, I would say, up to a point was maybe a little bit repetitive as well, in terms of I had to fill out a personal statement sort of application form for the university and do the same sort of thing for the placement as well. There was interviews for both elements of the process as well. There was an academic screening test, so it was quite intensive. There were quite a few hoops to go through, and I think at the time I felt like it was quite a rigorous screening process. It served as quite a useful refresher actually for actually getting onto the course, and made me feel a bit more confident about my skills in terms of getting onto it.
Yeah. I think I would totally agree with you. It can be very repetitive. So I've obviously had the privilege of being on the recruiting end, which I know you've not experienced. So from that perspective, it is beginning to change in some areas. So I know the university that I attended and where our current trainees are at, there's a dual interview process now. So it removes that repetitive having an interview with your placement provider and then going on to have an interview with the university. But some services won't have that in place. So yeah, you have to go through you have to jump through lots of hoops, unfortunately. And you can fall at any stage, which can be quite demoralising. You can have a really great application that gets shortlisted and gets you through. It can be very strong. You can do really well at your placement interview and then fail at the academic once you get to the university, or fail at the interview level at the university. And if you fail at any of those points, unfortunately, that's your journey over.
Right, of course. You mentioned this kind of element of a joint interview process kind of coming in more recently. Is there historically quite a lot of interface between the university and the placement provider during the selection process?
There is. I think that's developing. It kind of more historically, the placement providers have usually had the kind of privilege of picking people that they want to nominate, if you like. Although there isn't a formal nomination process at that level. But once we've identified people that we feel would be kind of valuable employees, we then would support them in submitting an application to the university and going through that process, and hopefully it all meeting together at the end. But like I say, sometimes it doesn't, and you know, if one of those elements doesn't come through, then that's it. Your experience can be over quite quickly, unfortunately.
What would you say your top tips are? Particularly, I suppose, as you mentioned, you're kind of sitting on the other side of the table now, and you're part of that selection process. What are your top tips for people who are embarking on this process?
I think the golden rule is know what you're applying for. It's kind of really funny, but we get an awful lot of applications that are people's skills are not being identified, and it's almost as though they're not really sure what it is they're applying for. So do your research. If you've worked predominantly in children's services, for example, then don't just tell us about the work that you did with children, because we need to know how you're going to transfer those skills across to working in adult services. Have that in your mind as you write your supporting information. Think about IAPT. If you don't know what IAPT is, go and find out. There is a lot of information. You only need to Google, and you can learn all about the history of IAPT if you want to go into that. You can read the current IAPT manual. I'm not saying it's a fun and exciting read, but it's knowledgeable. There's a lot of stuff in there that will support you in understanding what it is you're going to be doing for your career. And if we get applications where clearly people don't really understand what it is they're applying for, then you're very unlikely to be shortlisted. So you're not even going to get past that stage. Read the person spec. It's really simple, but read the person spec. If you don't meet it, don't apply. If you haven't got the relevant experience to meet a KSA, then don't apply, because even if we like you, the university won't accept you. You've got to be able to meet their requirements as well. So do your research.
Got you. Okay. Yeah, research is an incredibly powerful thing, and I suppose it's sort of usual job interview rules apply in terms of making sure that you're fully equipped before you go into a scenario where you're having to answer questions about the organisation that you're joining. I suppose as well, a couple of things I wanted to kind of tag on to that as well was mentioning things like lived experience can sometimes be quite a powerful thing.
It really can. I think if you can provide some examples of your experiences of either going through a mental health system, whether that be positive or negative, don't worry about telling us where you've been let down, and what you would want to see happen differently, what you want to kind of make different for other people. Do that. Let us know. What I would say is that whilst having lived experience is incredibly valuable, and please share that, if you're currently going through a significant period of poor mental health, it's really worth considering whether the timing is right for you to apply to do a course like this.
Right.
And I say that from a kind of well-being perspective, because it does take a lot out of you, and it can be very mentally and physically demanding.
Of course.
So it may be that you want to kind of go and have some personal therapy and have some experience of that, and then come and apply, when you're feeling in a position where you're able to kind of support your own mental health.
Yeah.
Before you try and support other people's mental health, because you can't do that if you're kind of a little bit depleted yourself.
Yeah, I think a really key takeaway from that is that if you are not ready this year, it doesn't mean that you're never going to be ready.
Absolutely.
And I think that as Shell said, if you take the time to kind of look after what your needs are first, I think it has potential to make you an even sort of stronger therapist actually in the future, knowing that you've been through elements of the journey that clients might resonate with.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's incredibly valuable, and it will be a big part of your experience. But yeah, you need to be in the position to kind of look after yourself first.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of definite do nots during the application process, what sort of springs to mind?
There are a few things that are a real turn off when we're shortlisting, and for me, it's kind of very clearly stating that this is a stepping stone move for you.
Right.
I massively support people having careers and developing and kind of getting to a place that they want to get to. But equally, I support IAPT, and I'm passionate about people coming into a role because they want to offer something to the population that they're serving, and make their kind of contribution to that really something special, not just a stopgap. So these aren't roles that I think people should go into lightly.
Yeah.
And I don't see it as just a stepping stone into psychology, for example.
Yeah, of course. And I think this role is one where you can really make a difference to people's lives, particularly if you embrace it and you run with it. And I think that the sort of key phrase really is you sort of get out what you put in.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
And I think if you sort of make the most of that ethos and regard it as something, as a real opportunity rather than something that's just kind of something that you're going to see on the way to something else. I think that is a really powerful way of approaching it. One thing I wanted to sort of stress as well, as you were talking there, I got this quite vivid flashback in my mind to one of my interviews. I'm not sure whether it was sort of a PTSD flashback type of thing.
Traumatic.
Yeah. Well, it's the reason I say that is because it was of me maybe giving an answer that probably wasn't 100% correct as part of the process, and as we tend to do as human beings, I definitely remember sort of beating myself up over the answer after the interview had finished, particularly given that the interviewer that I had in that moment had kind of had informed me that maybe I wasn't quite the best informed in terms of the answer I was giving.
And was this your placement or your university interview?
This was university interview.
Okay.
And so I think the thing to stress from that, though, is my sort of takeaway is that you don't need to be the finished product. I don't think and this is purely from my perspective, I can't obviously speak for any sort of admissions teams or teachers out there, but I don't think that universities are always looking for people who know the sort of CBT treatment manual inside out.
Yeah.
And I think they're quite keen actually sometimes to take on people who, although they've got some experience, they might have some gaps in their knowledge, and they can kind of see potential for growth there.
Yeah, of course. You're not going to university because you know everything. That's not the point of being there.
Yeah.
The point is that you're going with a willingness to learn, a kind of open-minded attitude, and an enthusiasm to do the very best that you can do whilst you're there. So, and I think one of the lovely things about CBT in particular is that imperfection and getting things wrong isn't necessarily looked down on.
Yeah.
Because it's the whole ethos of CBT, right? We're going to get it wrong. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to mess it up. And when that happens, it's kind of our interpretation of what that means about us as people or what we've done. And I would like to think that a good university or a good placement provider would absolutely look at that as being a positive. It's a growth opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. In terms of the sort of interview side of things, what are the top tips that you think we haven't covered so far that you'd sort of like to add for anyone listening in terms of just purely the interview side of?
I think it's the interview process is not dissimilar to other interview processes. So it kind of like you said earlier, the standard things that you would expect. So be prepared, ask useful questions. I think, when you get that opportunity at the end, when we say, have you got anything you would like to ask, if all you kind of come back with is, how much am I going to get paid? It's not really that exciting a question to answer. So have a think about, what are you really hoping to get from this experience? Have you got any genuine kind of gaps in your knowledge about what the role might look like that we could help you with now? And good eye contact. Be friendly. You're going to be working with people, so we want to see how you interact with people. And at the end of the day, that's what we are when we're interviewing you. We're just other people at the end of a screen or face to face if you're lucky enough to have that experience. So show us how you interact to bring those skills into the room. We appreciate nerves. Everybody gets nervous, and that's absolutely fine. And I think, like you said, you're not there to be perfect. If you don't know something, say so. Don't bluff your way through. But be enthusiastic about going and finding out. But yeah, it's exactly the same as all other interview processes, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's also quite an important thing to remember that if you've got to the stage of getting an interview, there would have been certain things in your application or certain skills and experience you have that have sort of merited that. And I think it's important to remember the skills and experience you have had in the past and sort of leverage those and use them to your advantage in terms of the knowledge that you do have.
That's true.
And don't worry about kind of coming in and feeling as though you're a complete blank canvas, because you're not.
Yeah, no, that's really true. You're right. We've seen something in our shortlisting, haven't we? That's meant that you've gotten to this stage. So run with that.
Okay. In amongst all of the interviews and sort of face-to-face elements of the process, there is also the question of an academic test on the university side of things.
Yeah, the academic test. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's the thing that strikes fear into the heart of every applicant, isn't it? It's mysterious and mystical, and nobody really knows what to expect. I think so. The experience I had, I was asked to kind of critique a journal or a piece of research, and I'd never done anything like that before. I'd come from a degree, so I was a counsellor by background, and kind of that just wasn't an element that was included in my degree. So I was very shocked. And I think I mentioned last week, my turnaround was really quick, so I hadn't a lot of time to prepare. I didn't have time to go and talk to people to say what should I expect.
Right.
So I was really very surprised when I turned up and this was the task. Actually, on reflection, it wasn't difficult. Mostly it's common sense. And I think if you breathe, take your time, read the questions, and kind of think about it in a very logical way. What are they asking me to do here? You don't need to get kind of bamboozled by all of the strange figures and jargon that's within the piece of research, because actually that isn't what they're asking you to do. They're not looking necessarily for your ability to understand long words. What they're looking for is your ability to interpret the question and then go and investigate, be curious. And curiosity is one of the most important things for a CBT therapist.
Yeah.
So it's a very good test, actually.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree with that. I can also acknowledge, though, that there may be some people who are entering this process who haven't come from an academic background.
Yes.
And who maybe haven't had the opportunity to maybe look at a journal article or something like that before.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, just in terms of a technique on being able to critique research papers or articles, have you ever heard of G.R.A.V.E before?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Ah, okay. Well, this is handy. So, G.R.A.V.E is an acronym that we can really quite nicely use to demonstrate some of the things that people might want to look for in a research paper.
Okay.
And research papers are obviously the most enjoyable things on earth, hence the jaunty music bed we've got in the background.
I like it.
But G stands for generalizability, which is one of those annoyingly long words that we're probably trying to avoid.
It is.
But it essentially asks how well can the findings of a piece of research be applied to other people within a population.
Okay.
So let's just say if a study only has 7 people taking part in it, all of whom are male within the ages of 18 to 25 and from one street in a suburb of Paris, the research findings may not really transfer over to people who are within a different demographic, for example. The R stands for reliability. So would you get the same results if you did the test over and over again? So for any of you listeners who went to a primary school or high school in the UK where you did science and you had to do every experiment 3 times to make sure it was a fair test, it's essentially that sort of thing.
Okay.
Applicability. So does it relate to something that happens in real life? Does it influence therapeutic practice in any way?
Okay.
And does it provide evidence for an existing theory, or is it something completely new that we've never discovered before?
Right.
The V in G.R.A.V.E stands for validity. So are we sure that the thing we have measured has changed because of the thing we have manipulated, basically? So, for example, if a cohort of 100 people have reduced anxiety symptoms from a research trial involving CBT change methods, what has the researcher doing the piece of research done to ensure that it's CBT that's made the change and not something else?
Yes. Yeah, it hasn't just happened by coincidence.
And E stands for ethics. So did the study have ethical approval? Were there any particular ethical procedures or protocols that were followed?
Wow, that's very interesting. I wish I'd known that.
And that is G.R.A.V.E. There is a great resource actually on Pavlov's blogs that I will link to in the show notes as well. So if anybody likes the concept of G.R.A.V.E. as just having a little bit of a framework to critically evaluate a paper, they can read more about that there.
That's brilliant. Thanks.
You're very welcome. Let's take a short break and we will be back very shortly. Welcome back to this episode of Two Lost Souls. So before the break, we spoke a lot about the process of getting onto the high intensity course. So the application process, the academic test, interviews, etc. And now let's move on to a topic that lots of people are really concerned about. And I was speaking to a few trainees who said that it actually got to the point where this almost put them off applying. So I
Right.
think it's really important for us to cover this as part of the show, and that is the KSA. Now, KSA stands for Knowledge, Skills, and Attitude, and it takes the form of a portfolio and a compilation of various documents that you've accrued over the years of your work, and essentially combined into this rather large piece of evidence that you submit to the BABCP. Um, what was your recollection of the KSA process, Shell?
Yeah, so I hadn't completed my KSA before I applied for the course. And I know some people do that, so they start working on theirs sometimes years in advance, compiling all of the information. But I hadn't done that. And it is a huge task to do right at the beginning of your training year. I was very lucky in that I don't know whether it was just that it was all a bit lax or I just got away with it, but I didn't actually hand mine in until 2 weeks before the end of the training year. But it doesn't work like that anymore. You have to have it completed, all your evidence is signed off, all your references there, normally within the first 2 weeks. So, yeah, was that your experience?
Yeah, it was. I remember being quite concerned by the process. I definitely remember thinking that I wouldn't pass it, and to be honest, I wasn't quite sure what needed to go into it beforehand.
Yeah.
There is obviously a lot of guidance on the BABCP website, but it's quite arduous to go through, and it's quite difficult to kind of unpick what actually needs to go in there as a document, I think.
It is, and it always surprises me when you say how worried you were about it because you've got quite a vast um, working experience with being in supporting roles, mental health type roles, and I'd literally just done a bit of counselling. And I wasn't worried about that at all. I was very confident that I would have enough content to fill it. I think it's surprising when you actually start to break it down, how much you do know and what it is you have done in your past. There'll be so much that you've done that is a transferable skill. And as long as you can evidence it, then you've got something for your portfolio, for your KSA.
100%. I think on reflection, it was definitely a very affirming process.
Hmm.
So knowing that I had worked in mental health for quite a long period of time, and completed loads of sort of e-learning and CPD stuff that felt like it was just sort of disappearing into a black hole, or as if it was just a tick box exercise at the time.
Yeah.
It was nice to be able to actually reflect on the knowledge and the courses, and e-learning things that I had done, and also use
Hmm.
the certificates for something as well. I thought that was quite a powerful thing to do. Um, you spoke there about kind of the level of things that need to go into the KSA. What about sort of the referees, or what sort of guidance is there on that?
I would encourage people to use as broad a range of references as possible. Don't rely on just a few people. Try and kind of contact lots of different people. You have to be really on their back sometimes because their sense of urgency may be very different to yours in the universities. So it's stressing to them how important it is that they get it back to you in a timely fashion. And also, I think sometimes it's useful if you can show them what it is you're looking for. So send across an example, for them to use as a bit of a template and a guide. Because
Hmm.
it can, I mean, I've been on the other end of the process and I've been asked to provide references towards a KSA. And you can be a little bit stumped as to what to write, what's appropriate. Does it need to be a few paragraphs? Does it need to be an essay? So give them a bit of guidance. And there are examples all over the BABCP website, but also look for kind of live, real life examples of your peers, your other people on the course who may have some examples as well.
Yeah, definitely. Shell mentioned they're reaching out to a wide range of references. So in terms of the sort of minimum requirements of the portfolio, you need a minimum of two different referees throughout the portfolio.
You
So
do.
you can't just have one person sign everything off. There needs to be at least one other alongside that. When it comes to sort of the lengths of statements as well, I was pleasantly surprised when it came to receiving feedback from my portfolio that people didn't need to sort of write War and Peace
Oh no.
in terms of their references and this and sort of the countersigned statements and things like that. As long as you've got two pieces of evidence or two examples rather, for
Hmm.
each criterion, and almost treating them like a competency based job application. So those sort of job
Yes.
applications that sort of say, think of a time when you did X or Y, and using that as the basis to formulate what you're going to write in response to that particular criterion, I thought was quite a helpful way of approaching it.
Yeah, definitely. And if you put too much information, I think, consider how boring it's going to be for the person who has to mark all of these. There may be 30 people in the cohort, and to go through all of those KSAs, it's going to be quite an arduous task. So um, keep it succinct. Make sure you're only putting in the information they're asking for.
Mhm.
Don't deviate off, because actually you might be stealing away information that you need for another of the requirements. So yeah, keep it brief.
Yeah, definitely. It's also worth noting, so we spoke about it being quite a reflective and affirming experience. Also worth mentioning that you need to write a biography as well,
Yeah.
as part of that process, which will be maybe slightly longer than some of the other statements that are in there because it tracks your entire journey,
Yeah.
almost from the start to where you're at this point, at the time of application as well. Just before we kind of move on, there was a handy tip that you had about the BABCP templates as well, and spell check that I know
Yeah.
you wanted to share.
Yeah, so the all of the forms that you need to put into your KSA are available on the BABCP website, and you can populate them directly from there. But I would suggest that you don't, and type everything into a Word document first, because it will be spell checked. Um, I found out the hard way that that doesn't happen if you do it on the sheets that are on the BABCP website. And then you have to go back and check all of your spelling and grammar. And if you can get a bit of support with that, why not? So yeah, copy paste is your friend.
Definitely. And just sort of going back to the evidence that you can submit as well. We spoke earlier about things like mandatory training and e-learning certificates and things like that, but also things like
Yeah,
job descriptions and sort of self-directed study logs can be quite powerful to include there as well.
absolutely. And I think if you come across one of the criterion and you really are struggling to come up with some evidence, go and have a look at what piece of training you could do in order to fulfill it. So I had to do a short course on future learn, I think,
Mhm.
um, and it it met the criteria. I think it was a 3 hour course, self-directed. It was completely free, didn't have to pay for it, but it was sufficient, and it meant that I had the evidence. So just go and have a look and see what's out there. There's an awful lot that will support you in meeting all of the criterion.
Yeah, and if you are worried that you aren't going to meet a particular criterion, I think it's also really important to raise it early.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
I think it's important to know that academic teams are usually quite supportive, and will give you the time and space to make considerations and improve your skills so you can fulfill that criterion as well. Um, One thing I thought was quite useful to mention as well is that obviously when you're on the course, you'll be working under the supervision of a BABCP registered therapist, or will have supervision from a BABCP registered therapist. Sometimes it'd be quite useful to just ask to see an example of a portfolio, because I
Absolutely.
think that takes a lot of the mystery out of it, and you can really almost take the sting out of the tail, and stop it from being this big monster in the corner, once you kind of
Yeah,
see one in the flesh.
definitely. And they will want to share it with you. I know whenever I'm asked if somebody can have a look through my KSA, so potential new students, I'm really proud of it. I'll quite happily take it in and let them have a look through it. And if they find something useful, that's great. So, yeah, please don't be afraid to ask.
Definitely. So we have obviously done what we can today to try and discuss elements of the KSA process with you. But if you have any further queries or any other concerns about the KSA, drop us a line on Twitter at TLS_pod, or by writing to our email address, which is twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com. And speaking of emails, we like to have a route through our mailbag in this segment, which we like to call Socratic Questions. This question comes from Caleb in Somerset, who says, I would really like to enroll onto a CBT course, but I'm slightly worried about the prospect of having therapy while I'm learning. Do trainees have to have therapy while they're training?
Oh, very good question. No, is the short answer. It's not a requirement for a high intensity CBT course.
Mm-hmm.
I disagree with that, though. I think it probably should be. I think it can be very valuable. The course itself is quite reflective anyway, but for me, there's something very powerful about having spent some time in the opposite chair, experiencing what it might be like to be the client,
Mm-hmm.
how daunting it might be to come for that first appointment, being vulnerable, sharing things. So, I mean, I'm a fan of therapy anyway. That's why I do this job. And I think it can be useful for most people. So, yeah, I wouldn't mind if it was a requirement, but sadly it isn't.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, first of all, key disclaimer, you're asking two therapists about whether you should have therapy. But also a couple of other things. I think firstly, it really does help you sell some concepts when you are a therapist, if you've been through the process and sat in the other chair. Sometimes going through it allows you to really understand the rationale for doing things, and really sell it better to your clients. But also, as you began to touch on there as well, Shell, um, sometimes, I mean, you will do role plays and experiential learning as part of the course, and you are encouraged, on a lot of those occasions, to turn those role plays into real plays. And so, even if you're not having therapy while you're training, chances are you will be asked to be quite reflective and actually talk about things that are happening in your personal life. And it may be worth reflecting on why you might not want to do that at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I really agree with that. I think that's a very good point. Um, what we want to do is take any stigma out of having therapy, don't we? It's really important that we promote it as a positive and useful thing. So, it mightn't necessarily be CBT that you experience, but talking to somebody in a professional capacity might be a helpful thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for the question, though, Caleb. And if any of you would like to get in touch, again, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter at TLS_pod, or our email address is twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com. But just to round off today's episode, if you have enjoyed or learnt anything from today's show, please give us a follow, and let us know on Twitter at TLS_pod, or by email at twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com. Or if you can do, please consider donating to our Ko-fi at kofi.com/TLS_pod. Links to all of those places are in the show notes. And if there is someone you know who would benefit from hearing Two Lost Souls, please, please, please share this show with them. It is a really huge help to us. But all that's left for me to do is say a quick thank you to Michelle.
Thanks, Ravi.
And say a big thank you to all of you for listening, and just give you the news that this Halloween a new CBT clinic is opening, specialising in treating zombies who have experienced PTSD. Dr. Frank Enstein says he's gratefully looking forward to starting the clinic called The Reliving Dead.
Ooh. Ooh.
Thank you for listening, everyone, and have a good week. Take care. Two Lost Souls was presented by Ravi Amrath and Michelle Sudbury. To get in touch, contact TLS_pod on Twitter or email twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com.